Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started here. I want to welcome you to the CSG eCademy webinar. Today's nonpartisan, non-advocative session on autonomous vehicles and insurance is presented in collaboration with the Griffith Insurance Education Foundation. My name is Sean Sloan. I'm the Director of Transportation and Infrastructure Policy at the Council of State Governments in Lexington, Kentucky. You know, CSG has been excited to partner with the Griffith Foundation on this webinar and a series of other events over the last year or year and a half on insurance-related issues. And to say more about this collaboration, I want to call on Frank Tomasello, the Program Director at the Griffith Foundation. He joins us from suburban Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Frank?
Thank you, Sean. Both the Griffith Foundation and CSG share similar missions, which include a commitment to a nonpartisan, non-advocative, and academic approach to programming. And it's this commitment that's at the core of our collaborative relationship. It's our pleasure here at Griffith to work with CSG. Together, our organizations provide an opportunity for policymakers to gain valuable, unbiased knowledge about insurance, and to do so through the lens of critical and emerging issues.
Thanks, Frank. I'll ask you to introduce our speaker here in just a moment, but before we do that, just a quick note on how the webinar will run. If you have a question for our speaker at any time during the presentation, you may type it directly into the GoToWebinar interface on your computer screen. There's a question box on the GoToWebinar taskbar you can use for precisely that purpose. We will collate those here in Lexington and ask as many as time allows. And now back to Frank Tomasello to introduce our speaker and get things started for us.
Thank you, Sean. We're pleased to be joined today by Dr. Brenda Powell-Wells of East Carolina University. In the hour ahead, she'll discuss the potential benefits and challenges presented by autonomous vehicles, consider the likely impact on insurance models and products, and also examine the many questions and challenges that this new technology will present for public policymakers. This is an interesting topic, one that's top of mind for many public policymakers, given Ford Motor Company's recent announcement that it plans to mass produce fully autonomous vehicles by the year 2021 for use in commercial ride-hailing services. Dr. Wells is the Robert F. Byrd Distinguished Professor of Risk Management and Insurance at East Carolina University in Greenville, where she serves as Director of the Risk Management and Insurance Program. Dr. Wells has spent nearly 3 decades studying and teaching in the field of risk management and insurance. She served as an expert witness and a consultant on several court cases, and has authored many articles published in professional journals. Dr. Wells, I thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Frank and Sean. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to welcome everyone to the webinar, and I'm very honored to be able to bring to you the latest news on autonomous vehicles. So let's dive right in and get started. What is an autonomous vehicle? It is defined as a vehicle capable of sensing its environment and navigating without human input. Now, how does it accomplish that? There are several things that have to be on board the car to make that happen. You have to have radar, which is detection by radio waves. You also have to have LiDAR, which is laser detection. You have to have motion sensors or odometry. You have to have computer vision, and you also have to have global positioning satellites or GPS. Next slide, please. Now, just to distinguish between a couple of terms here, autonomous implies that something has the power to self-govern, to make decisions and to make up its mind about something, and that it can act alone or independently of another person or a person. Automated implies controlled or operated by a machine, and really these what we're calling autonomous vehicles are really more automated vehicles than autonomous, but autonomous has become the more commonly used and familiar term, and that's the term I'm going to use today. But if you want to split hairs over definitions, really the autonomous vehicles that we see coming out in the next few years are really automated vehicles. Next slide. Now, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has classified autonomous vehicles into 5 levels. Level 0 is what most of us have. We completely control the vehicle at all times. Some of you may have a level 1 vehicle where certain individual vehicle controls are automated by the car. Maybe electronic stability control. You may have automatic braking. You may have something like the ability to parallel park automatically. There are at least 2 controls automated in unison in a level 2 vehicle, such as cruise control in combination with keeping within the same lane. Level 3 takes it a step further. The driver in a level 3 vehicle can fully cede control of all safety critical functions. That's a pretty big step. The car senses, though, when the conditions require the driver to retake control and gives the driver a, quote, sufficiently comfortable transition time. That's how it's been explained to me, for the driver to take back over control. But in a level 3 vehicle, you're reaching the stage that you could, as a driver, hand the control of the car over to the car and let it do its thing while you presumably do other things. Level 4 is not really available yet, but that is what we define as a vehicle that can perform all functions on an entire trip, with the driver not expected to control the vehicle at any time during the trip. These types of vehicles could include unoccupied cars, automated vehicles that don't even have a driver in them. So you've got a whole range of options here, and just as an FYI, on the next slide, there is a slightly different classification system designed by the Society of Automotive Engineers. And they have recognized 6 levels of automated vehicles, and I won't bore you with all of those, but they're sort of a similar classification system, just carved up a little bit differently. Next slide. Well, let's talk about the good and the bad for these automated vehicles, because autonomous vehicles. First of all, 30,000 fatalities in the U.S. occur every year, and 93% of all auto accidents are due to human error. We expect the computers, lacking in emotion, lacking in distraction, will be able to drive much better than humans, resulting in fewer errors, reduced accidents, fewer injuries, and fewer fatalities, which, from a driver safety perspective, is a very big benefit. We also predict that once you can automate these vehicles to the point that they are level 4 and don't have a driver, you can reduce your labor costs. Of course, the flip side of that is somebody's going to be out of a job, which is kind of one of the negatives. Reduced driving and navigation chores mean more leisure time. Presumably, with an autonomous vehicle, you could read a book, you could play a game, you could do work. There are a lot of things that you could be doing while you're in the car that would free up other time for more leisure. One of the biggest benefits we see with autonomous vehicles is that they are expected to get rid of driver impairment. You know, a 16-year-old will no longer be a danger behind the wheel, presumably. Someone who's intoxicated or impaired due to alcohol or medication would be able to operate a vehicle as well. The vehicle would do the operating for them. This would be a big safety feature for someone who suffers from seizures or vision problems. It's particularly important to the elderly who may have diminished driving capabilities with age and with declines in vision, hearing, and in some cases, cognition. So it presumably would, again, make your roads a bit safer. With a fully automated, I'm sorry, I keep getting the words, I keep interchanging the words. With a fully autonomous driving fleet on the road, You could go at higher speed limits and have smoother rides because you would not be worried about driver error. You could lower the gap between vehicles because the vehicles could sense each other and know when to stop. That would improve traffic flow and reduce congestion. That would reduce your need for traffic patrol. You would also, and we'll say more about the insurance issue as we go along, but really you would reduce your need for auto insurance. Because what's going to happen is with an autonomous vehicle, most of the accidents are going to ultimately be product liability claims. If an autonomous vehicle has an accident, we would blame the manufacturer and not the driver because the driver wasn't in control of the vehicle. The vehicle's self-awareness could reduce or certainly deter theft. And if you take the steering wheel out, you got a lot more room in the car, which improves the ergonomics. And especially for some of the more complicated vehicles to drive. I know when I was younger, my parents had an RV, and none of us could drive it but my dad. He was the only one that knew how to drive that large of a vehicle. Well, if we can automate and make those driving functions autonomous to the vehicle, then large vehicles will be easier to use and everybody will be able to use them. Next slide, please. Now, with these come problems. The one I just mentioned is now in an autonomous vehicle, when there's an accident that's not the driver's fault, that's out of the driver's control, the liability is going to be placed on the manufacturer of the device, of the vehicle, of that particular navigation system, or the software that's operating the vehicle. And as you'll see in a little while, it may be difficult to determine liability in those cases. There's a lot of time needed to get an existing fleet of vehicles to autonomous level. You can't just go out and plug something into the car in your garage and make it autonomous. It's going to take a lot of time to get autonomous vehicles on the road and to get non-autonomous vehicles off the road. People also don't want to give up their cars. They love their cars. And people love to drive. Some people love to drive a lot. Some people hate to drive. But there is a segment of the population that does not want to give up control of their car. As we'll also talk about later in the presentation, there are a lot of legal and regulatory challenges for self-driving automated autonomous cars that we have not tackled yet. Inexperienced drivers are going to result if we hand everybody an autonomous vehicle. Think about it. Right now, I'm 48 years old. I've been driving for 32 years. If you count my learner's permit, 33 years. I've got a lot of driving experience. You take somebody who's been handed an autonomous vehicle, they don't know how to drive a car. If they've always relied on that navigation system and that autonomous system, so you're going to have more inexperienced drivers when complex driving situations arise that require manual driving. You're going to have a loss of jobs, as I mentioned. Professional drivers and unions that perceive job losses are definitely going to oppose this type of technology. One of the biggest concerns I think people have is the loss of privacy and the data sharing because basically you've got vehicle-to-vehicle communication and then you've got vehicle-to-infrastructure communication such as with intersections, traffic lights, road and signals and things like that. So, you know, it brings to mind George Orwell's Big Brother in 1984. I mean, somebody's going to know where you are, and there's going to be a record of where you were and where you drove and how fast you went there, and that concerns people. From a homeland security perspective, we see these cars being used as terrorist devices because if there's no driver required, it would be easy enough to load one up with explosives and use it as a bomb without injuring anybody on our team, so to speak. If you saw the movie, I'm trying to remember the name of it right now, iRobot with Will Smith. In that movie, at the start of the movie, it shows the robot going down and rescuing him from a car that was submerged underwater. And he had a horrible guilt complex because the robot saved him and not a child that was in the car or another person in the car. Think about that from the standpoint of a computer. If a computer is going to have an accident and it sees the accident coming in a car, let's say it has a choice to hit a brick wall that will kill the driver or to hit a child crossing the street that will save the driver. How does the computer know which decision to make? There are a tremendous number of ethical considerations in how we program the technology into these automated vehicles so that they make good decisions and make the decisions that are best for society and best for the driver of the car. Also, on a lighter or probably less important note, gestures, nonverbal cues by police, pointing, waving, pedestrians are not going to be adapted to autonomous driving. So there's going to be issues there with those types of cues that may not be autonomous or be able to be read by autonomous vehicles. Next slide. Technically, we're concerned, first of all, about the software. I'm going to tell you a story in just a little while about a car that failed. The software didn't do what you would have wanted it to do. That seems to be a big hurdle to getting these cars out on the market. Computers can be compromised. The communication systems can be disrupted or jammed. They can be hacked. The weather implications, navigation systems can be subject to harsh weather conditions and be less reliable. We are going to need very, very high quality, specialized, up-to-date maps to make an autonomous vehicle function properly. The radio spectrum is going to be used, competition for the radio spectrum is going to be steep because all the cars are going to need to use it. Our current infrastructure is not adequate. There are going to be changes needed for autonomous cars to function optimally. And right now, today, we estimate that the cost of making a vehicle truly autonomous is $70,000 to $100,000 more than the cost of the vehicle itself. And that's prohibitive for the vast majority of people. Now, once mass production begins, we estimate that's only going to be $3,000 to $5,000 additional. And whether or not people are willing to pay that depends on who you ask. Some people think that sounds like a bargain, and some people say, no way, I'm never going to give up my ability to drive. Next slide.
Well, thanks, Dr. Wells. And before we move on to the next topic, we just want to remind folks again, if you have a question for our presenter this afternoon, you may type it into the GoToWebinar interface in the question box at any time. We will ask as many questions as we have time for. Before we move on to talk about the track record of autonomous vehicles, let me ask you this, Dr. Wells. You noted that a challenge presented is a potential resistance of individuals to forfeit control of their cars. Have any studies been conducted to identify attitudes towards the use of automated vehicles and to understand the rationale behind any resistance to this new technology?
Yes, there's been one study that I did find. The Florida Department of Transportation studied the attitudes of the elderly on adopting autonomous vehicles, especially since, as I mentioned, the elderly stand to reap some of the most significant benefits from this technology. The study conducted there found that the biggest issue is trust. People just don't trust the technology yet because it hasn't been proven. They are inherently afraid of equipment failures. I think people want to see it develop. I think more people, based on my reading, I think more people than not want to see this technology develop and become trustworthy, but we're just not there yet. Other concerns include, like I mentioned, privacy. That's a big one. Legal liability questions. How are you going to assign blame for an accident that happens? And location tracking. You know, like I mentioned, everybody, you know, there's going to be a record of everywhere you are and everywhere you go in an autonomous vehicle, and that concerns some people quite a bit.
Well, thanks, Dr. Wells. I will throw it back to you now to take us through the track record with regards to some of the companies at the forefront of autonomous vehicle research.
Okay. I am, just a moment, please. I'm having a computer issue. I'll be right back with you.
Okay. While we do that, we'll just remind folks again that if you do have a question today, you may enter it into the GoToWebinar interface on your computer screen, and we will see that here in Lexington and ask as many questions as we have time for. Dr. Wells, are you back with us?
Yes. My computer decided to go to sleep on us.
Okay.
I wasn't quite prepared for that. So, yes, let me get back to where we were. I apologize. Okay, so let's talk about the track record that these vehicles have. Mm-hmm. Google's self-driving cars have had a pretty good track record all the way around, and I would say, in my estimation, they were really the pioneers of this technology. I think they pretty much spearheaded. I mean, there are other people who've been working on it longer, but I think Google has really done a good job of getting this out there and testing it. As of August 2012, Google announced that it had completed over 300,000 autonomous driving miles absolutely accident-free, and had about a dozen cars on the road at any given time. Within a little under 2 years after that, they revealed that they had a new car out that was 100% autonomous, that was, as we mentioned before, a level 4, with no steering wheel, no gas pedal, and no brake pedal. Absolutely nothing for a human being to control. By this year, they indicated that they had test-driven a fleet of cars that in autonomous mode, and they have done over 1.5 million miles. And if you'll go to the next slide, I'll tell you what that track record is on those. They've had a total, in 1.5 million miles, they've had a total of 14 accidents. 9 of those, the car was rear-ended by someone else. In 2 of those, the vehicle was sideswiped. In 1, another driver rolled through a stop sign. 1 of them, an employee, was driving the car manually. And in 1 of them, the car had a decision to make, and it was trying to avoid sandbags and struck a bus. So if you look at that, really, in my mind, the autonomous vehicles only had 1 of those wrecks that we could really blame the car for. The rest of them were all human error, mostly outside of that car. Now, what most people have heard of this year is the Tesla, the Model S, and if you'll go to the next slide, I'll tell you about it. It was pretty big news in May. The Tesla falls between a level 2 and a level 3 on the NHTSA classification scale that we went over earlier. In May of this year, we had our first fatal accident involving the car and an 18-wheeler. Now, I researched this, and it depends on who you ask what happened. So I'll start by saying what Tesla reported. Tesla said that neither the autopilot of the car nor the driver noticed the white side of a tractor trailer against a brightly lit sky. So the brake was not applied. The car drove under the 18-wheeler and killed the driver. That is the first known autopilot death in over 130 million miles driven by its customers with autopilot engaged. According to Tesla, there is a fatality every 94 million miles among all types of vehicles in the U.S., so their track record is still better than human error. Also, it's worth noting that they cannot play movies on the car's screen. Now, according to the truck driver, when he approached the car, the driver had Harry Potter playing on the TV screen, which is impossible from the technology of the car. According to the Highway Patrol, there was an aftermarket DVD player in that car. So if you go to the next slide, let's go back and look at what a level 2 and a level 3 vehicle are.
Well, but before we do that, Dr.
Okay.
Wells, let's just remind folks again that if you have a question, please enter it into the GoToWebinar interface. And before we do move along, Dr. Wells, let me ask you this. Do you, we've seen sort of things on sort of a fast track to some degree at the state level and at the federal level in recent years. Do you expect the Tesla fatality to have any kind of slowdown or chilling effect on moving the autonomous vehicle agenda forward quickly? And how would additional casualties or injuries impact the policy landscape and the insurance industry? Because sometimes these things do get to some degree blown out of proportion just because of the publicity they receive and that sort of thing.
Right. Sean, personally, I don't see this slowing it down at all. I don't see it having any kind of chilling effect on moving the AV agenda forward. And the reason I say that, too much research has been done and too many resources are invested in this technology. You can't put that genie back in the proverbial bottle. With Ford estimating it can have autonomous vehicles out in 5 years on a mass production basis, I think we're just seeing the beginning of this movement. I also think that once people learn the circumstances behind the Tesla fatality, they can easily understand that a big chunk of the cause of it was driver inattention. And that's really not the fault of the technology. It was between a level 2 and a level 3 vehicle, and even at level 3, the driver is supposed to be able to take over immediately. If the car says, you've got to drive now, the driver's supposed to be available to take over the function of driving. And from all accounts, this driver did not do that. Didn't see it coming and was possibly, I presume this is all accurate, was probably watching a movie and wasn't paying attention. So I don't see this as really being a problem for the technology. I think, there'll be some urban legends that go along with it, but for the most part, I don't see this having any kind of chilling effect on it.
Yeah. All right, well, why don't you take us through some of the other policy implications of autonomous vehicles that may be coming down the road?
Okay. Well, let's talk about, first, let's define something called a disruptive innovation. A disruption in the market or a disruptive innovation is something that creates a new market, a new value network, but it also disrupts an existing market and an existing value network, displacing established market-leading firms, products, and alliances. So it is both good for some people and bad for some people. Next slide. So autonomous vehicles are definitely a disruptive innovation. They're creating all kinds of new things, and they're going to upset a lot of other things as well. Let's start with the issue of, are they really safe? Okay, the driver was not able to re-engage in time to avoid the accident. Even though the technology was clear, the driver must remain alert. Levels 4 and up are viable approaches, according to Dr. Alexander Hars, who is an expert in driverless cars. The Tesla accident not only shows a software problem where the car didn't see the truck, that is partly the software's fault, but the problem between levels 2 and 3 goes a lot deeper. If you'll change the slide, please. This is what I was just talking about. At least with level 2, at least 2 controls are automated, and with level 3, the driver can fully cede control, but has to be willing to take control back. And what the doctor is saying is those are very dangerous levels to be at in terms of the car's development, because there are going to be people who don't pay attention. They're not going to take the car back. They're not going to take the control back. They're going to get busy doing other things. Now, at a level 4 vehicle, we're sitting there going, okay, yes, you can cede control and you don't have to take control. The car can do it all. But at level 3, you're still relying on human beings and human behavior, and that is an uncertainty that is just going to cause problems. So in general, the technology that's out on the road today is considered by some experts to be the most dangerous, much more so than a fully autonomous vehicle. Next slide. Let's talk about what it does to driving behavior. Okay, an autonomous vehicle is going to make driving a lot easier, and thus it may increase miles driven. It will increase fuel consumption as a result. It will increase traffic and road congestion, and although we believe one of the benefits of driverless technology is a reduction in traffic flow and a reduction in rubbernecking, because the computerized car is not going to stop to look at an accident. It's just going to keep going. So, but at the same time now, when I'm busy doing something, if I'm reading a book or I'm working on a presentation for you, I can just get in my car and go do it and let the car drive. And so it may ultimately increase how much I use my car. At the same time, there are those who believe that the autonomous vehicles will be able to be co-owned and shared by multiple people, because not everybody needs their car 24/7, and the car could be for certain rides and for certain tasks. So it may actually facilitate sharing and thus decrease miles driven. It will enable better carpooling. There'll be less idling in traffic and smarter route planning. Computers don't get lost. They don't circle for parking spots. They'll know where the parking spots are. So as a result, we hope total miles traveled would go down, and as total miles traveled goes down, we reduce fuel consumption, oil consumption, and greenhouse gases. Another potential unintended side effect of these vehicles is now is going to work going to be a joy. You know, is that hour-and-a-half commute in the morning going to be fun time to play a game or get work done? And in that case, will people be less inclined to live close to where they work? Will that increase urban sprawl with people going, I can live 90 miles from home, it's no big deal, my car will get me there and I can work on the way? So we don't really know what the net effect is going to be on driving behavior. Next slide. Another issue, how do we assign liability for accidents? If driver behavior is completely taken out of the accident equation, then the claims for accidents are going to be based more on blaming the manufacturer of the car. Okay? The need for auto insurance will thus go down, and the auto insurance market is fully expected to shrink with this technology's development. But at the same time, when an accident occurs, who do we blame? Do we blame the people that made the car? Do we blame the hardware? Or do we blame the software? Or do we blame the person or the company that made the mapping platform? Or do we blame another car if it sent a faulty signal out on the highway that was perceived by our car inadvertently? So assigning blame in car accidents in fully autonomous vehicles is going to be a difficult task. Next slide. Another issue, is our infrastructure ready for this? First of all, we need to consider lighting, because radar needs a certain amount of light to operate when you're using radar vision. And do we have enough lighting on streets to make that vision work properly? Little things like, if a street sign is covered in graffiti, can the car's vision system read that sign and interpret it correctly? Automakers, are they going to want to make these? Are they going to want to tool up and make autonomous cars if only a few places in the country are truly ready for them? And the answer to that is probably no. Are we going to have to radically change our roadways? Our roadways are already in many areas crumbling and in need of repair. How are we going to pay for upgrading those roadways, street lights, and sensors? In 2012, scientists started working on smart intersections designed for autonomous cars that have no traffic lights and no stop signs. They use computer programs that will communicate directly with each car on the road, and you wouldn't need traffic signs, you wouldn't need traffic lights. But how do we equip every intersection in the country with that kind of technology? That's going to take a tremendous amount of money. Next slide, please. And here's a little unintended, not so obvious change that will come with autonomous vehicles. If we reduce human traffic errors, we're going to reduce traffic citations, and that's going to reduce government revenue. It's also going to put traffic officers out of jobs. It's going to reduce insurance claims, which will put claims adjusters out of jobs. If we have reduced insurance claims, we're going to have less work orders for body shops, less medical bills for chiropractors, emergency rooms, less attorney fees. We're going to put a lot of people out of work with this type of technology. Next slide.
And here again, Dr. Wells, we just want to remind folks to send in your questions via the GoToWebinar interface on your computer screen. We are collecting those here at CSG headquarters, and we'll ask as many as we can before time expires. Dr. Wells, I know that next you're going to take us through the autonomous vehicle legislation that we've seen to date. Before we do that, I wanted to ask, I suspect that a lot of folks, both inside and outside the autonomous vehicle industry, are anxiously awaiting the guidance for states that's expected sometime later this year from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Once the NHTSA guidance comes out, do you think that will sort of open the floodgates to new legislation during the legislative sessions in 2017? And what shape might that next wave of legislation take?
Sean, I do think this is going to open the floodgates. NHTSA had their meetings, had at least one, I think two, possibly open meetings in April to hear everybody's concerns about these vehicles. And they're formulating their recommendations and what they have to say about these vehicles from a safety perspective. And I think everybody's waiting to hear what they say. Right now, we don't know what to do with these cars legislatively, and it's being handled on a piecemeal basis, as we're going to see in the next section of my presentation. Once some consistent guidelines are issued by the Traffic Safety Administration, I think our legislators will be in a much more informed position to take action. I think you'll see legislation focus first and foremost on public safety issues. For instance, how many people have to be in an autonomous vehicle at all times, what kind of driver behavior is acceptable when using one, and things of that nature.
Great. Well, can you now take us through the legislation that we've seen to date?
I'll give it my best shot. If you look at this map, you'll see that it's pretty hodgepodge. We have some states, a few states, and I guess it qualifies as a handful of states that have allowed autonomous vehicles. legislatively, we've got a handful, and then one state has issued an executive order to allow autonomous vehicles. Next slide. The question that we have to ask is who or what agency is responsible for overseeing autonomous vehicle safety and testing? For example, how many people have to be in the vehicle when it's being tested? And most states have not addressed this issue at all. If it's being tested, how many people need to be in it? If it's ordinary operation of an already tested vehicle, how many people have to be in it? And there's you know, as you'll see in a moment, that has been legislated in some jurisdictions. What limitations are going to be on driver behavior? Should that driver of the Tesla, was he watching a Harry Potter movie? If so, should he have been doing that? Can you text while you drive? Can you watch movies while you drive? Those are questions that have to be answered in the legislative process. Next slide. Just to give you an example, Nevada was pretty early on in this movement back in 2011, and they gave their Department of Motor Vehicles authority to regulate safety and specify allowed testing areas for cars. It requires one person to be behind the wheel and one person in the passenger seat during tests. And it absolutely prohibits texting and driving. So that's just one example of one law. Every state that has passed a law has done something a little bit differently. Some of them, you know, may be similar in some ways, but we really don't have a consistent legal framework yet.
And just another quick reminder to get in your questions. We've already received a couple of them here in Lexington, and we will ask those at the end of the program today. And Dr. Wells, you're going to take us, you're going to wrap up by taking us through, you know, what the future may hold for autonomous vehicles based on public opinion and what the market players are telling us. But before we get to that, I wanted to ask you a couple of additional questions about autonomous vehicle legislation. Assuming we do see this sort of opening of the floodgates next year following the NHTSA guidance, will it matter at this stage whether there is any kind of uniformity in state statutes with regards to autonomous vehicles, or will that only be important later on once we have these vehicles sort of going between states and that sort of thing?
Well, I think we've learned from other legislative issues, insurance for one, vehicles and safety for another, that uniformity across state lines is, for the most part, desirable. And if you think about, in particular, vehicles and safety, we all have the same drinking age. We all have very close to the same speed limit. It doesn't make sense to me to keep approaching this randomly and without coordination, given that these instruments, these vehicles can easily cross state lines. I mean, you know, are you going to say, if you don't get some consistency, you could have somebody who's perfectly in compliance with the law cross state lines and be in violation of the law. So I think consistency is very important in this issue. But
you know, in some cases, I guess different states have sort of different relationships with the partners that they have in their state who are working on autonomous vehicles. You know, we've got Pennsylvania has Carnegie Mellon University, which has been doing this research for more than 30 years now. You know, Massachusetts has MIT. Michigan has the automotive industry. California has Silicon Valley, which has an interest in these issues. You know, but the states, do you think that they're going to have different goals in passing legislation here in the next couple of years?
I think in the short run they may have different goals, but I think this issue is going to snowball very quickly in every state because of the mobility of these cars and the fact that they can cross state lines in a split second. I think the states you mentioned definitely have a commercial interest in fast-tracking legislation. But I think if you look at it, the states that immediately surround them also have a vested interest in progressing with their legislation because those vehicles are going to cross state lines. That's going to happen. So I don't know that in the immediate short run, like next year, would it make sense for, I'm in North Carolina, would it make sense for North Carolina to do something, you know, with this? Well, that depends on what our industry here dictates in the short run. But in the long run, these cars are going to be traveling over state lines. They're going to be made in Michigan. They're going to be shipped to North Carolina. So I think we need consistency, just like we have with the Department of Transportation for trucking. So I think it's going to happen, and the technology is rolling out so much faster than we originally thought that it might. And I'll talk about that in the next part. But I think this is coming so much faster than anybody thought it would, that it's going to have to be consistent.
All right. So take us through what lies ahead here.
Okay. Well, first, let's see where we are public opinion-wise. What do people want? What are people demanding? There have been several surveys and opinion polls taken domestically and internationally. In 2014, Insurance.com found that over 75% of licensed drivers said they would at least consider buying a self-driving car. If we threw in that car insurance would get cheaper, that number rose to 86%. So it's not off the table that people are going to adopt these cars. I think they are going to. 31.7% said they just wouldn't drive anymore if an autonomous vehicle was available. So I think there's demand. I think people want these cars. I think they're asking for them. In 2015, Delft University surveyed 5,000 people from over 100 countries. And even though respondents enjoyed manual driving the most, they still found some interesting results. 22% of those said, no, I wouldn't pay anything for a fully automated vehicle. I want to drive myself. I want to control the vehicle. 5%, though, indicated they would pay more than $30,000 for a fully automated vehicle. 33% said a fully automated vehicle would be highly enjoyable. And 69% estimated that fully automated driving will reach a 50% market share by 2050. Now, those same people had concerns, the same concerns we've talked about already. The privacy issues, software consistency, software reliability and abuse, and the legal issues. Those are all the things that we cited before are concerning people about this technology. So we're not without concerns and without challenges. But overall, people seem to kind of want this technology. So I think public opinion-wise, we're headed in that direction. If you'll advance to the next slide, please. The autonomous vehicle availability. And I looked this up online, and you can see the various estimates of when this is going to be ready. Volkswagen estimates that they will have an autonomous vehicle ready by 2019. GM, 2020 or sooner. Ford said 2020, and then this week, or last week, said 2021. Uber expects their entire fleet to be driverless by 2030. And so, and various manufacturers are saying different things, but it's all going to happen in my lifetime. It's going to happen in my son's lifetime. This is not George Jetson stuff that's coming, you know, a few hundred years from now. This is coming in this century. So, like I said, I don't think we can put this genie back in the bottle. It is here to stay, and it's going to happen. And next slide.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Wells. We want to get to the questions sent in by those watching the webinar today. Again, if you do have a question, you may type it into the GoToWebinar interface on your computer screen where it says questions, and we'll see those here in Lexington and direct them to Dr. Wells. We'll ask as many questions as time allows in the last 10 minutes of the broadcast here this afternoon. A couple that we received here in Lexington, first of all, and you addressed this a little bit, what do you see the impact of autonomous vehicles on independent repair shops?
On independent repair shops, I think, there's still going to be a need for auto repair. But as the technology on these is proprietary, and each manufacturer is coming up with their own systems and their own ways of doing things, I think some of the technology is going to have to be shared for them to work on public roads. But each car's systems will, to some extent, be very proprietary and very unique and probably patented. So that's going to bypass the independent auto body repair shop, because it's going to have to go to the manufacturer for repairs, because these are going to be highly technical computers. These are no longer cars; they're mobile computers, massive computer systems. With the reduction in auto accidents that should come from this, it's going to take business away from those auto body repair shops. The auto repair shop that you know today probably will look very different in another 50 years. I expect most of that would be taken over by dealerships and by companies, by auto manufacturers, I mean. I think that's going to be a real issue that people in that industry need to be prepared for.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question we got here in Lexington. Given that human error will continue to be a factor until such time as all cars are autonomous, is there any consensus on how to introduce autonomous vehicles? For example, as part of public transit along specific routes or things like that, in order to limit the problems? Or, and this is what this person says, is it just a Wild West approach for every community?
I think, based on what I'm reading and what I'm seeing, I think the inclination of the industry is to roll this out in sort of a public transit mode first. If I understood Ford correctly, and if I didn't, Frank, you or Sean, correct me, but if you know differently, but I understood that what Ford is planning to do is really get this introduced in public transit and mass transit first, and in commercial vehicles first, rather than handing over autonomous vehicles to every person on the road, to just individual drivers. So I think that will provide a good testing ground for the technology that will work a lot of the kinks out before we roll it out to the average consumer. But unless the legislators get a handle on this, then I think you do have the potential for, as you put it, a Wild West scenario, because if the laws are different in every state, then autonomous vehicles are going to develop at different rates. They're going to have different technologies. They're going to have different rules across state lines, and it's going to be really hard to get this rolled out in a safe manner that benefits society the way we hope that these vehicles will.
Another question we have for you. This person asks, how do you anticipate the courts will analyze liability in lawsuits that might be filed in cases involving accidents between autonomous and non-autonomous vehicles? And how will insurers react in this interim phase?
I think that's a really, really good question, and I wish I had the answer for it. I think you've got so many different scenarios in there. If it's fully autonomous vehicle related, if both vehicles in an accident are operating on an autonomous basis, then I think it's going to be a product liability issue. If it is a combination of human error and autonomous vehicle, I think it's going to end up being something that trial lawyers absolutely love in terms of litigation potential, because it is going to be a question of fact for a jury. And these are going to be complex cases with a lot of details, a lot of technical information that will require somebody to sort this out. Now, if in the process of legislating the state, if in the process of legislating autonomous vehicles, if they build something in for that would make it so that those are easier to determine, then that might bypass that problem. But I do think this is going to be an interesting question for the court in every state. Definitely.
Yeah.
And
all right.
I don't have an easy answer.
Okay. If anyone else has additional questions for the good of the order, you may enter it into the GoToWebinar interface. I do want to turn back to my colleague Frank Tomasello at the Griffith Foundation to get his take on what we've heard this afternoon and see whether he has any questions for our speaker.
Thanks, Sean. Dr. Wells, it's been an enlightening and an informative session. Thank you very much. Questions abound. This is obviously an emerging topic and one that will evolve rapidly, but our time is very limited. So in the couple of minutes that remain, just a couple of questions for you. In light of this new technology and these developments, can you speak a bit to the notion of personal auto insurance? It will change, as you've suggested. Do you feel at any point it will become obsolete? If you could address that, we'd appreciate that.
I don't think it will become completely obsolete, because you're going to have this very expensive, highly technical vehicle that's still subject to fire damage, hail damage, a tree could fall on it, floods. So to that end, I mean, when you look at auto insurance, personal auto insurance, it has several components to it. One of those is liability for damage you cause other people to suffer, but one of those is physical damage coverage to the vehicle. And that comprehensive other than collision portion of the policy, you're still going to need that. You know, you're still absolutely going to need that, because cars are going to be financed and the lender's going to require you to have coverage on that. So I don't think that personal auto insurance will become obsolete, but I do think if you have a 100% autonomous vehicle force on the road, I think liability insurance is going to become obsolete. But as long as humans still operate vehicles, we will need liability insurance, because they make mistakes. And there will be consequences for those mistakes in court. So what is expected in the industry is not that personal auto insurance will go away, but that it's going to shrink, because you're just going to simply need less of it. There's going to be fewer circumstances where it is necessary. So I think it's going to shrink. I don't think it's going to go away completely.
Understood. Thank you, Dr. Wells. I know we're up against a 3 o'clock sort of hour here, but we'll sneak in one final question. We'll go with an insurance-related question. You spoke just a few minutes ago sort of about this notion based upon our understanding of Ford Motor Company's recent announcement, among other things, that at least initially the use of autonomous vehicles will likely see that in more of a public transit capacity. And I wonder if you might just take a moment or two to speak to that with respect to whether use of those vehicles in that capacity might have a different set of implications for the insurance industry, and if so, what do you think that might sort of look like?
Well, you know, off the top of my head, what I see happening is, just like now, you know, we have, in most states, there's a limitation on governmental liability. So if we put autonomous vehicles into play on behalf of governmental entities, then the liability for accidents, the liability for malfunctions and things, you know, is definitely going to be treated differently than it would be if it were an individual. And so, you know, I see a certain amount of limits on governmental liability in the sense that public transportation will largely belong to the government, unless, of course, somebody decides to privatize that. But I really, you know, the fundamental issues of blame, of fault, are still going to fall back on the manufacturer. If it's truly autonomous, that manufacturer is going to have some responsibility if anything goes wrong. So I don't think that changes regardless of who's using the vehicle.
Thank you, Dr. Wells. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Well, thanks, Frank, and we are just about out of time for today's webinar. We want to again thank Dr. Brenda Powell-Wells of East Carolina University for her participation. Thanks also to our friend Frank Tomasello at the Griffith Foundation. This webinar has been recorded, will be archived in the CSG Knowledge Center and by the Griffith Foundation. So if you missed any part of the program or would like to recommend it to a friend, it will be available soon. Be sure to check the CSG website for information about future eCademy webinars as well. I'm Sean Sloan at CSG headquarters in Lexington. Thank you for